comment, we request that you fill out the little white cards. They're available in the foyer. Pass them to the city clerk so that we'll have the information necessary to be able to communicate with you in the future if that becomes necessary. I have no white cards. Has there been any indication of anyone wishing to address the council? Is there anyone in the audience who had intended to address the council and simply didn't get the cards filled out? Seeing nobody moving, I will assume that there is no request for public comment. We now have before us the proposed budget for fiscal 08-09, and I will turn the meeting over to Mr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Tonight is the beginning of a process to adopt our fiscal year 08-09 budget. You will note that there are some significant changes in both the formatting and the presentation of the budget. Budgeting time is always a nice opportunity to look at the overall condition and direction of the city, as well as what has occurred over the past 12 months. The state of California is a rather unique environment in terms of how government derives its dollars. Probably as complicated a structure as you will find anywhere, certainly in the United States. And with the passage of Proposition 13 approved by the voters, there was a shift throughout the state away from reliance upon property tax, which are a relatively stable and predictable source of funding, onto what are described as user fees, which are fluctuate very greatly with growth going on in the economy. And so much of California derives its revenues based upon there being very robust growth, residential, job growth, commercial growth, increase in personal income taxes. And so that is the reason that we see these wild fluctuations in the state of California in terms of the amount of revenues that are coming into them, and the reason that the state of California finds itself in such difficult budgeting times where they're currently facing a $16 billion deficit. Without significant structural changes in the tax structure in the state of California, that is the beast that we will all live with. And so the city of Victorville, being a substructure of the state of California, we fall within those same fluctuations, and therefore our revenue streams very much fluctuate with growth in the economy. And as everyone is aware, California and the entire nation right now are going through almost no growth, and we are seeing the impacts of that upon the city of Victorville. However, it is important to point out that the sound underlying financial principles of the city of Victorville have never been stronger. Prior to the closure of George Air Force Base, virtually all growth in the city of Victorville, and in fact the entire high desert, was residential growth. People were moving to the high desert to purchase homes because of low-cost housing and quality of living, but they were commuting to jobs down below. And as we saw in the beginning of the 90s, when the market went soft, the entire valley went through a very difficult financial time for most of the 1990s. With the closure of George Air Force Base, the city began to look at its long-range plans and to address what had been created, which is a very large housing-to-jobs imbalance. And the city of Victorville embarked upon a plan, primarily through the formation by the special legislation of the VITA redevelopment project area, of investing heavily into economic development in order to enhance that portion of the economy that supports the type of fluctuating housing growth that we experience on a cyclical manner. And that underpinning is the creation of jobs, the creation of industry, creation of retail and commercial, so that you have a sustaining portion of your economy that supports the housing, and also then your entire economy is not depending upon the housing market, which can fluctuate up or down radically. The results of the effort of this city council and that plan that it began upon in the early 90s is nothing short of remarkable. If, Brandon, you could put up the first slide. It's a graph of the valuation of property within the city of Victorville. And as this graph demonstrates, valuation remained pretty much stagnant throughout the entire 1990s. And it was in the late 1990s when the VITA redevelopment plans began producing tax increment money for investment into the community. The results are unbelievable. This kind of a growth curve, I think, for anyone that is running a business, and Victorville is a corporation, that type of a growth curve over the last 6 years is nothing short of remarkable, and that is a direct result of this council's decision to invest into economic development, which creates a strong fundamental underpinning for the market, irrespective of fluctuations within the housing market. The next graph shows similar growth, although this simply focuses on retail activity, which is just a portion of our economy, and you see the same type of remarkable growth over the past 10 years in terms of the retail activity that has been occurring within our community. Now, these are dollars. These sales tax only represent 7.5% of what the businesses are taking in. So these businesses that have either located into the city of Victorville or existing businesses that have expanded, this graph is a graph of their increase in business activity. So over the past 7 or 8 years, the results of our economic development efforts have been nothing short of remarkable. We are being impacted now because of the state structure, with a significant portion of our revenue stream being tied to housing development. We are seeing those revenues fall off dramatically, and there are some charts that have been provided to you from the packet from our finance director that indicate that. Over the past 12 months, this city has accomplished, I think when you put all of these items together, something that no other city could have accomplished or has accomplished in a period of 12 months. We completed the water department consolidation. Now, this is a significant issue, not only because it secures the long-term interest in reliable water resources for our valley, but the impact upon the organization. We began to see the economy tightening up last year, and so we put in place a hiring freeze in response to the flattening of the economy. With the water department consolidation, when you put both of those two water districts together, you had too many employees to carry out that function, and so the city absorbed a great number of those employees into the city budget. Obviously, that has an impact upon the city budget of increasing your expenditures at a time when your revenues are not increasing at the same rate. And you've already seen some of the results of that, such as the customer service program that is now very visible within City Hall, and other programs that are not as visible that now have had increased staffing because of the consolidation of those two water districts. To further verify that the consolidation of those two water districts were able to lower the total number of employees, not long after the consolidation of the water districts, the city of Victorville did a water rate reduction to its employees. So while that had a very positive impact upon the rates and reliability of the water, it did have a negative impact in terms of the city's expenditures. The city has implemented almost overnight a full-service paramedic program. As the council heard at the city council meeting, the presentation from some of the other cities, these are generally programs that are implemented over a 5-year period. There's some benefit financially of implementing over a 5-year period, particularly when we're in a time as we are right now with flat revenues, that has less of a dramatic impact upon the budget. But this city council, having over a period, well over a year, being briefed on all of the need for a paramedic program, made the decision to implement that program immediately. And I think, as you have read and heard, we have already seen very dramatic stories of individuals who have received first-class paramedic service from the city of Victorville through our contract with the county. And so that program, while it is unquestionably a huge benefit and increase in service to the level of our constituents, it does have an impact upon our current budget. The city just last June, by a vote of nearly 70% of its citizens, became a charter city. That vote is overwhelming. I think it is a clear demonstration from the electorate in the city that they have an extreme level of confidence with this city council and the direction that this council has been taking this city, and by approving the charter have indicated that they wish to give the city council members more tools and abilities to accelerate and enhance the efforts that you have already been successfully pursuing. We received, just I think about a month ago, a permit from the California Energy Commission for the Victorville 2 power plant. In addition, with all of these other activities that we have been pursuing with the water department consolidation, the paramedic program, and the charter city program at the same time, we were undertaking a monumental task of achieving a permit to construct the Victorville 2 power plant, which will be the first hybrid solar gas-powered plant in the nation. Would have been in the world, but Spain is going to beat us, I think, by a little bit. That is a phenomenal achievement. Southern California Logistics Airport. 12 years ago, just short of 12 years ago, I think it was in November of 1996, former George Air Force Base began commercial operations with the first aircraft landing. It was a L-1011 carrying troops, and that began SCLA's commercial operations. Starting up an airport, as anyone who's experienced in that field can tell you, is a very daunting task. The vast, vast majority of all airports in the nation operate at a loss. They are operations that are supported by various taxing revenues and sources to prop them up. Very few airports actually generate enough revenue to be self-sustaining, and those are most of those are small airports. To take an airport the size of SCLA and convert that into a commercial operation and then achieve financial success is something that generally would take 20 to 30 years. Rickenbacker is considered one of the premier examples of a successful base reuse, and 25 years after opening, their airport still operates at a loss. They have very tremendous development around the airport, but the airport itself still operates at a loss. I'm very pleased to announce this year that SCLA has achieved, basically it's out of the red. It is generating enough revenues from its operation to cover its cost of expenses, and operating expenses are very high. You have a full air rescue firefighting contingency out there, same level that is provided at LAX. They're there 24 hours a day. You have an aircraft control tower that is operating 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you have customs that is there around the clock. To have that kind of an operation in that facility to now break even is just a tremendous success, something that happened way ahead of what anybody could have anticipated to occur. It's because of bringing businesses like GE, Pratt & Whitney, FedEx, and very shortly Boeing to come on board as well. This city did recognize that in order to provide its citizens with the type of quality of life and amenities that are necessary, we needed to follow a different path. If you follow the standard path in California, which relies upon sales tax primarily and some property tax, it's a losing proposition. The cost of providing services to your citizens through housing exceeds the revenues that they bring in through sales tax and property tax. And so over the long run, your cost of providing services will exceed your growth in your revenue sources. We've seen this over and over again. It boggles the mind that a city such as San Diego, when you go and look at San Diego and think this must be one of the most financially successful cities on earth, to find out that they were close to bankruptcy, and that other cities that appear to be very successful are having financial troubles and difficulties. This is simply the nature of the tax structure in the state of California. And if you're going to follow that path, in my opinion, it is a path of diminishing returns. In addition to that, then, the state, whenever it gets into a fiscal crisis, as it is right now, reaches in and steals money from cities in order to try to balance their budget. This has been documented, that has occurred 13 times in the past. The state is talking about doing it again now, in addition to all of the other wacky ideas that they're floating out there to try to balance their budget. So in order to take the city in the direction that both this council and its citizens feel it ought to go, you need to chart another path. You need to be able to generate revenues that are not subject to the state tax code, nor are they subject to theft by the state of California. And the city has embarked upon these programs. SCLA is one, an airport. When you look at cities that are financially successful, generally they all have an airport. We have began down the path of energy, and that is very much expanding now with the community choice aggregation. Again, when you look at cities that are financially successful, they generally do have that component where they are providing power and gas. And we are also looking at many other great opportunities. There's the Desert Express train, and we're also looking at an inland port concept. You must have these kind of activities and revenue-generating activities to sustain the kind of economy and community that we are all interested in. It is not possible to sustain that simply on housing development. So while we are seeing now an extreme downturn in our housing development, the truth is the real financial foundation of the city of Victorville has never been stronger and continues to grow. We are just about to execute, or we've already executed an agreement. We're just about to break ground on a new Schweppes Dr. Pepper facility. There's another facility right behind that that is going to go forward. So we are still seeing growth in the things that are important to a solid financial foundation. Now, our current situation, we're faced with fluctuation in the revenues that are directly related to housing development. There's no way around that. We've got to tighten up our belts and suck it in. Over the past 5 or 6 years, we actually have been building up reserves. Our revenues were coming in at a very robust rate. We grew the city very rapidly. Our expansion, particularly in police forces and anti-gang activities, has been very tremendous. But now we need to cut back. We have built up reserves, but we have been burning through our reserves, which is that's the appropriate approach to take. When the times are good, you put away a little money. When the times are bad, you rely on that money to move forward on a cash basis. We have gone to our employees. I met with virtually every employee in the city, presented them with an explanation about the financial situation of the city and, again, the long-term vision for the city. And it was a very gratifying experience to meet with our employees. They are all very supportive, enthusiastic, dedicated, and they all share the long-range vision for success that this city council shares. They also recognize that there are fluctuations in the economy, and that requires belt tightening, and they are prepared to tighten their belts. Our employees have agreed to a reduction in working hours in return for what will be a phased-in reduction in wages. As the City Council is aware, every year the City Council grants a cost of living increase. That is the appropriate thing to do. If the cost of living goes up and employees' wages do not go up, in essence, their pay has been cut because they now have a decreased spending ability. And so their ability to purchase goods and provide for their family is reduced if there is not a cost of living increase. So the employees, in order to be a team partner in moving forward with the city, have voluntarily gone forward with this reduction. Now, the department heads, in my opinion, department heads, based upon their workload, do not have the ability to reduce their hours. And in fact, with all of the employees within their department reducing their work hours is going to create a greater work burden upon the department heads, requiring them to put in more hours. And I was concerned about that. However, our department heads unanimously have stepped up and said that if the employees are going to take this reduction in pay phased in, that our department heads are team members, they're there with their employees, they're there to lead, they are going to do it as well. And I find that just another remarkable example of the dedication of our department heads. With that, unless there are any general questions, I will turn the meeting over to our finance director. The general direction to our finance director and all of our department heads has been to essentially freeze staffing and freeze service levels at their current level of last year. And then the finance director has been doing some remarkable work in terms of going through and changing the way we budget and identifying where we have opportunities to use all of our resources available in order to not only get through the tough economic times, but also to keep this city moving forward in the direction that it embarked upon 10 years ago.
Questions or comments from members of the council?
I just have a question in regards to the hours their employees are working, or the reduction in hours. Does that increase their hourly rate? They're not reducing their salary, they're reducing their hours. Will that increase their hourly rate?
Councilman Cabrales, employees' pay is represented in two different manners. As the council is aware, you adopt a salary schedule each year. It's generally part of the budget or comes in shortly after the adoption of the budget. And the salary, the pay for employees is expressed in two different manners. Primarily, when you look on that chart that you receive that has each classification, each range, and each step, it is actually listed as a monthly salary. Now, there is, for accounting purposes, an equivalent hourly rate that is broken down. Now, that's necessary in order for internal auditing for things such as overtime and other activities. But actually, what is adopted is a annual salary. So what will occur is that schedule will remain the same. There will be no changes in those schedules. Now, in order to maintain that internal auditing that we do, we will do an internal adjustment of the hourly rate.
So the hourly rate will be higher then?
It will, but the City Council does not adopt hourly rates.
I
And again,
understand that,
I wish
John.
I had a copy of that.
We adopted the
monthly
schedule,
salary.
and it's a monthly salary that we adopt. But to convert it to overtime, as you mentioned, then if you reduce the hours and your salary stays the same, then your conversion then will increase your hourly rate.
That's correct.
Okay. Will it have any impact on your sick leave or your vacation?
Well, it has no direct impact, just that freezing. In essence, what it's going to be is approximately a 3-year freeze of the salary schedule. And it depends upon what the cost of living increase will be. But the salary schedule will be frozen. So that really doesn't have any direct impact upon sick leave. Now, part of what also the employees agreed to was a reduction by 1 day of sick leave accrual and a reduction by 1 day, I believe it is, of vacation accrual. Now, the reason for that is not because of a financial reason. When the City Council unanimously approved the closure of City Hall on every Friday, it now means that there are 26 days per year, approximately. You've got to throw some holiday in there, but approximately 26 days per year now that employees are not here because of that action by the City Council. So if they're not here that day, they don't need a vacation day. They're already off. And statistically, if they're sick 20% of the time each day, they don't need that day of sick leave either, because they don't need to take a sick leave. That they've already got that day off by the action of the council to close City Hall.
But the formula is not going to change other than the reduction of 1 day on each.
1 day of each. And all of the employees heard that rationale and agreed that that's appropriate.
Further questions or comments?
What happens when, for instance, Friday was supposed to be their day off, and Mr. Sullivan must have had his shirt, you're smiling, had his shirt sleeves rolled up to his armpits to get this finished for us, to get it by Friday. So now, I'm sure Mr. Sullivan wasn't doing this by himself. I'm sure he had employees here. Are they going to be compensated for that day
Yes.
at the normal rate of pay?
Well,
Or would it be overtime?
There's various tools that currently exist and existed prior to this change for a department head to compensate for employees for working beyond their normal work week, which previously was 40 hours. That could be through the payment of overtime pay. It could be through the granting of compensatory time off for another time, and the department head works that out with the employee. Generally, it's the employee's preference.
Further questions or comments? Mr. Roberts, you've indicated that a part of the budget process will result in a reduction of expenditures that are geared towards general long-term development and job creation, and then limit on capital investments in that category, and then a redirection of resources from general community development to more basic municipal services. In each of those instances, has the amount of reduction and/or the amount of redirection been quantified? And from where will those funds come from?
Well, Mayor, the amount of the city has been very aggressive in terms of investing monies that are identified for economic development. There are, I think, 4 redevelopment project areas within our city. And it has been the policy of the city to aggressively reinvest those dollars as they flow into us in order to, as the graphs indicate, stimulate economic development within the community. Now, to the extent, and the numbers come into us, I think, only twice a year with respect to redevelopment funds, to the extent that we see a leveling off of those monies coming in, it will mean we will also level off correspondingly our investment. Now, much of what this city does, pardon me, is investment to attract development. This would be to put in place infrastructure or other programs that then can be used to market and to bring industry into our city. Where our focus will be now will be to use those redevelopment dollars to secure deals that are going to happen within the foreseeable future. And I'll use Dr. Pepper Schweppes as an example. That is a deal that is on the table right now. We recognize what the economic benefit of that deal is, both in terms of assessed valuation creation, tax increment creation, and job creation. And then, based upon knowing that those benefits are going to actually occur within a specified time frame, that's where we will focus our investment.
Well, and I don't disagree with that approach, but I guess what I'm looking for is something different. You know, when I look at the budget, it's balanced, and I look at the general statements of reducing expenditures on long-term development and redirecting funds away from that as well. it just seems to me that mechanically, as the budget was put together, at least for some departments that are directly involved in that, there must have been some quantification of what those reductions and those redirections would be. And I guess that's what I'm looking at, just to try to get a handle on the order of magnitude. And I don't know that it's important that that occur in this discussion tonight, but I, for one, want to know what those numbers are, at least in an order of magnitude. You know, are we talking $10, or are we talking $10 million of redirection or reduction? So at some point, I'd like to have a better feel for what that is.
We shall provide those numbers, Mayor.
Any other questions or comments? So Mr. Sullivan's on the hot seat. Go home? Oh. I noticed.
Good afternoon. As John Roberts stated, I'm John Sullivan. I'm the Finance Director for the City of Victorville, having joined the city last December. This is the first annual budget in which I have participated, and before going further, I want to thank the many staff members as well as department heads, the city manager, the deputy city manager, many others who worked so long and hard in this budget process, often working late into the night and on weekends to get this document put together. My objective in this presentation this afternoon is not to go over each piece of the budget, as to deal with 300-plus pages, it would take us all night, but rather to provide an overview and interpretation of what this budget means. I think the best way to do that is to reiterate and reinforce budgetary concepts, followed by a discussion of significant matters. Following this, we'll have time to discuss questions that are more specific to a particular area. And we have here all of our department heads who will address any of those specifics. Budget concepts and methodologies, a long phrase, but it describes how our budgets are put together. Our budgets are composed of the general fund, together with I say moderate, but it's a reasonably large number of other fund types, which include special revenues, restricted funds, debt service funds, capital project funds, and proprietary or enterprise funds. Our budget also includes several legal entities which the city controls, consisting of redevelopment agencies, financing authorities. The budget itself is prepared predominantly on a cash basis, which is essentially based on cash flows. The focus is universally adopted for governmental entities as it most closely is aligned with statutory guidance governing city councils and current period management philosophies. However, in this city, we are blessed in the sense that while we necessarily focus on current periods, we are also focused on long-term solutions, which include jobs, housing, and infrastructure. To that end, we have constructed a number of long-term credit facilities for use in these projects whose benefits may not be seen for several years. Before I mention challenges, I want to emphasize what John Roberts had said, because nowhere is it clear in this document that our reliance needs to shift from the more traditional sources of revenue for the city. The purpose of attaching a graph in here on development fees is to show the magnitude of the impact to the city that happens when you are solely dependent to a large degree on a single revenue source. Development fee income, we've seen what happens. We were more than dependent, or reasonably dependent on development costs. We've seen what happens as we have gotten yo-yoed with the local economy. That's why, again, I want to emphasize the viewpoint of this council and this city in building more stable and alternate funding sources has been the right strategy and will continue to be the right strategy. As John mentioned, the challenges that we face are no different than cities all across California, and indeed the state itself, as we, the cities, and the state struggle to balance our budgets. Revenues have declined in several categories: development, some certain types of taxes, primarily in construction-related activity. I passed out a chart and a graph of this city for two reasons. One, to emphasize the magnitude of the challenge that we have, as well as to paint a picture of the right strategy of deferring our dependence to other sources. As you will see, the revenue that's construction-related, both for general fund and restricted funds, such as development impact fees, has declined from, I believe, an all-time high in the city of approximately $25 million for the year ended June of '06, it would be about $2 million for the year ended June of '09. That is a very conservative number. It was developed through input from all department heads. Again, it is very conservative, but that's one of the crosses that finance people carry with them all the time. They try to be as conservative as possible so that there's no surprises down the road. The one thing before we get into the budget on a grouping by grouping basis are the top 6 budget assumptions that are in here. First, VEMUS Interconnect Plan. The Council has dealt extensively with VEMUS Interconnection Plan. And as you may recall, the Interconnect Plan is to provide electric and gas to our commercial customers through interconnection with other sources rather than self-generation. Self-generation, as we know, is expensive. Cost of our fuel sources has increased exponentially. And at this time, the Director of VEMUS, as well as staff, feels that that is the way to go. We interconnect, we assure ourselves of more stable supply, more stable pricing. Through interconnect, we not only eliminate an operating deficit that was brought about as a result of uncontrolled fuel prices in the general market, but it frees up a significant amount of equipment used for generation, which it is projected to be sold and with those proceeds used elsewhere to support the city. The second assumption in our document is Victorville Power Plant 2. The budget reflects the plan to transfer ownership to a sponsor, which is another large utility company. This process is well underway, and at this point, we expect to be meeting with other companies starting this week. Some have commented that this is a change of plan. I've heard that mentioned in council meetings. It is from where we were 2 weeks ago or 2 months ago, but it is not a change of plan in the long-term goals of the city. As you on the council know, we started the Victorville plant project 3 years ago with a viewpoint of providing reliable power for commercial development in the Victor Valley. Secondarily was a profit motive. Our goal always was get the plant, get the jobs, get the economic development that comes with it, get the population. And so over the course of the recent past, the goal has not changed, but the way of reaching that goal has changed. And that's why the city is entertaining proposals from sponsors to take our position with the Victorville 2 plant. We've done a yeoman's job in breaking down all of the barriers to getting that plant to become a reality. This has been a 3-year process, which is very difficult elsewhere in the country, more difficult in California, but my experience and exposure to these projects is back east where they're coal-related. Those plants are not being built. Environmental groups are closing down construction of all coal plants in this country, which is going to leave California perhaps as one of the last bastions where construction of new power plants will occur. Nuclear's out, coal is out. The only plants that make sense in today's environment are the plants modeled after Victorville 2. I mentioned construction-related revenues. We do foresee a flattening of our construction-related revenues for this budget year. This year, we expect that those revenues will decline from approximately $12 million last year to $2 million this year. Now, since we're only looking at 1 year at a time, we fervently hope that that is a set of conditions that will exist for this 12-month period and this 12-month period only. We hope that the glut of houses as a result of foreclosures, builders' liquidations, we hope that that will be over within a year. You never know how these cycles work, but from everything that we have read, we believe that within this fiscal year, or very shortly after the end of this fiscal year, the glut of inventory will be absorbed. We will start construction activity. We will start building as we did 2 years ago. The fourth item is sales taxes, a smaller item, but nevertheless worthy of comment. John showed a graph of sales tax revenues that have increased almost exponentially, 20, 30, 40% a year during several of those years. Very nice graph. In the private sector, there's a lot of businesses that wish that their graphs looked like that. But we are seeing a slight decrease in sales tax in our budget this year, about 7.5%. It's not huge. It does reflect the trends that we have, in fact, seen over the last several months of our sales tax receipts, but nevertheless, it is a small decline. Item 5, staffing. The budget essentially freezes staff levels and compensation costs at their current rates. John mentioned that, but in addition, new positions, there are very few new positions, I think a total of maybe 4 or 5, and they require John Roberts' personal consent before they are filled. Other than that, vacant positions are not being filled. And last but not least, and again, John Roberts did mention this, it is our expectation that the state of California will refrain from balancing their budget by reducing local revenues and funds. We perhaps are naive now that we know that they've done that 13 times in the recent past to take funds from local cities, but we are nevertheless hopeful that they will come to their senses before they start taking money out of our pockets, which essentially are taking money out of the pockets of our citizens. At this point, I'll go through the budget document just in a highly condensed commentary, and if we have questions on a specific fund-by-fund basis, we have department heads who can address specific questions. The first item I would like to point your attention to is located on page 30. On page 30, we talk about the general fund overview. The first few paragraphs talk about a decline in sales tax revenue of $1,569,000. Again, that's the 7%. We comment in here about various sources of revenues, how those revenues, if the changes are significant, why those changes have come about. So we do have a decrease in license and permit revenues, again, construction related. Our sales taxes are down slightly. Charge for service revenues, small decline related to services and residential construction. Cost recovery revenues, those are an increase, primarily because of the traffic light program. Operating expenses in the aggregate, we are successful in reducing operating expenses from the 43 million 2 years ago, 42 million, and it's about the same this year, but we are this year, unlike in prior years, allocating part of the support costs to all other funds with which we can allocate those dollars. Some funds you can't allocate because those expenses are not permitted, such as CDBG grants. You can allocate expenses, but you will not be reimbursed for those. So we have sought to allocate costs from the general fund to all other funds to the maximum extent possible, consistent with the use of the revenues for those funds. We are, at this time, engaged in a DIF study, which is going to go through and calculate costs of all of those impacts to the city. The firm has been asked to expand that study to include a complete cost allocation. So the cost allocation schedules we have in here, while they were limited only to certain other funds, will be expanded to the city as a whole as a byproduct of that exercise. Transfers to other funds, that's an expense of the general fund. And as you know from reading the document, the general fund is the father of all other funds. If another fund needs short-term or long-term financial support, it is left up to the general fund to provide that support. Historically, the general fund has operated at a significant surplus. As John mentioned before, in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years ago, the general fund amassed some very large surpluses. But over the last year and again this year in this budget cycle, because the general fund revenues are so heavily influenced by construction activity, primarily residential, we have used some of those reserves. In prior years, we had the luxury of transferring those excess accumulated funds to other funds, DIF funds, various capital projects. We don't have that luxury this year because of the general fund revenues. The most significant elements of transfers to general funds include transfers to the Fire Protection District. Last year, we transferred funds into the Fire Protection District, and against the district, we assessed all of the, well, not all, we assessed quite a bit of the costs of operating the fire department. Not all of the costs, I would add. There are certain costs we did not allocate, and those were the costs that the council looked at before. Indirect costs, insurance, we did not have buildup of costs for long-term. We had the pension, we did not have the retiree medical. So there were certain costs that were not in the Fire Protection District last year that are this year. And the reason why they are this year is because these same expenses that we put into different categories, those same expenses the county does have. So the county has built them into their contract. The principal costs are the across-the-board pay increases, which occurred as a result of the county. Our firefighter employees generally receive higher pay today than they did 2 months ago. They have a good retiree medical plan. They have a better pension plan. They did, as a result of the transition, receive the enhanced pension benefit that this city was so challenged to make. They are now operating under 3 at 50, where previously they were at 2 at 50. So to those individuals, they did receive an enhanced pension. It was a good thing for them. But nevertheless, we will be transferring more money to the Fire Protection District this year than last year. Part of it is the way the funds are set up. Part of it are real increases from last year to this year. The bulk of those increases relate to those items I talked about: enhanced pension, funding for retiree medical plans, and again, the pension. The golf courses. The transfer to the golf courses are expected to increase by $382,000. That's consistent, not unexpected, but it's consistent with the upgrades going on to our golf courses, the expansion, and the cost of operating a golf course, frankly. The airport. Now, and I'll ask Peter to comment. I'm going to save this comment for Peter, but we do show an allocation of additional funds to the airport. And I'm going to stand corrected because Peter's going to give us some additional information on that. And the gas tax fund. Last year we had a transfer to the gas tax fund of approximately $800,000, slightly less than $800,000. During this budget cycle, we learned that a city has, I'm going to ask Francine, what is the proper term? Proper term for the gas tax fund? No, where we have to contribute.
Maintenance of effort.
Maintenance of effort. That's a very good term in state taxation. Maintenance of effort, which means that we have to pony up more and more money to prove that we're still putting forth a reasonable effort so that we can get the state funds. And so this year we're determined, whereas we were using an $800,000 number in previous years, it's actually $1.2 million. So it does look like we have, and in fact do have, an additional transfer from the general fund to the gas tax fund. But again, those dollars are being spent here for our citizens. Transfers from other funds. We do have a large number that represents a difference from prior years related to the Victorville Municipal Utility System. I mentioned in my opening comments that within VEMUS, that as a result of interconnect, we have certain types of equipment which are previously being used to generate electricity, some turbines and other types of equipment. Because we're going interconnect, some of that equipment is not going to be needed. And that equipment can be sold, and the funds there are being used to reinvest into other areas of the city. But one area that it will also be used in is to repay the general fund by VEMUS to the extent that the general fund supported VEMUS the last 3 years when they did have some operating losses. So over the last 3 or 4 years, it's balanced out. Now we're equal. Now VEMUS can go on, and the plan is to have that entity as a separate entity operating in the black. It may not occur this year. It probably will be in place by the end of the year. That is the focus that Glenn Casanova and John Roberts have worked on so strongly for the past 6 months, and has been reported to council. I'm at the point of looking on page 33 and 34, which are all the numbers on the general fund.
I have a question, John.
Yes, sir.
On your transfer of funds from the VMUS, the $14 million,
Right.
that's to pay back the general fund?
That's to pay back the transfers that the general fund made to VEMUS over the last couple of years. You'll remember last year, the year ended June 30 of 08, the general fund had contributed $9.9 million to VEMUS to support them in all of their efforts, operations, capital, and everything.
That doesn't repay all of it, it's just a partial.
It's a partial payment, yes. Because we did have, if we take a look at the 3 years, it's close to 12.5, 13 million. There was a year or two prior to then, but What we wanted to do is to ask for only sufficient repayment to help the general fund balance itself. The excess we left. So we're just,
Still,
there may be $1 million, $1.5 million from '04, but those numbers are not significant in and of themselves.
budget then reflects your revenues now that you're sell the equipment, reflects the monies.
Yes, VEMA's budget does reflect the liquidation of that equipment and the disbursement of the repayment back to the general fund.
Yeah, because you had 25 million for sale of equipment. That's
Right.
what that equipment will be sold for.
Yes, that is within a range that we believe is achievable.
Following what Rudy was saying there, the way we're restructuring VEMA's too is that there's an anticipation timeline here that we're going to become very black. I mean, we've
Yes.
flipped over to the O&M black, kind of ahead of schedule, but as we get further down the line, we'll get a bigger proportion on the payback ratio coming back. Eventually, it'll all be back with actually revenue added to the general fund.
Absolutely.
I understood it.
Yes, that's actually correct. Through the interconnect, you've got an automatic profit margin built in, which, although small, is opposed to our existing profit margin, where the cost of fuels is something that we cannot control. We're too small to hedge. We're too small to buy 1 million gallons of diesel fuel and other types of fuel in advance. So we're basically left at the mercy of the market. And as you all know from gasoline and diesel prices, those things have just skyrocketed. You know, unlike a city, we're just not large enough to buy hedge contracts, such as Southwest Airline, which is paying $1.50 for jet fuel because they bought so much and had a long-term contract. You know, we fortunately had to pay $5 and some change for the same gallon of fuel.
Councilman Rothschild, this follows a formula that the city began on over 20 years ago, I believe, which is rather remarkable, where the city actually invested into probably initially would be the Bear Valley RDA area and possibly the Hook RDA area. And then which in essence becomes seed money. It's difficult to start up a redevelopment agency. Initially, when you form them, there is no revenue coming in because the distribution remains as it was the day before. So the city seeded these projects, and as they became successful, then the funds flow back to the city. Same thing occurred with George Air Force Base. We all remember the difficulty in getting George Air Force Base transferred over from the Air Force and started up. Seed money that the city put in, and then that has been paying money back to the city. And so that's a formula that has proved to be very successful.
Let me add one comment to that so I don't forget, because this is something very near. Keith may talk about it here in just a moment. Property tax revenues, the tax increment generated at the project area George Air Force Base, has almost doubled within 2 years. John Roberts showed the graph of property tax values. We've seen the same thing, and it has been responsible for a huge increase. And that was the engine that in the late 90s, or the pump, that was primed. And we are now recognizing the benefits of that. Keith, I'll let Keith talk about some specific numbers because they pass through the Victor Valley Economic Development Authority. But those numbers are nothing short of staggering, the success just in the past 3 years.
Buildings are privately owned then.
That's true, Councilman Carvelis, but that's not a requirement. Even buildings that are publicly owned, let's say the airport authority owns a hangar and then rents that hangar out, the county does charge a property tax component called possessory interest tax. And so even facilities that we own and rent out also create tax increment.
Okay, I've concluded the general remarks on the general fund. If there are any questions as to any one of these departments specifically, behind the cover sheet are all of the departmental budgets and staff levels. And I would ask the council if they have any specific questions as to any of the departments. The department's heads are here to respond.
Before you go there, John, on the budget document itself, On what would be page 12. I want to make sure I understand this summary correctly. Shows a budget of 0809, total revenues $331,708,704. Am I reading this presentation correctly, that that is the total estimated revenues for 0809? There's no other revenue sources that are not included in this summary?
That appears to be correct. We do not have any bond proceeds within there.
$331 zip. I guess that's what I'm trying to get. What is the city's total revenues? Is it more than the 331? And if so, how much?
That would be, on page, would be 275 million. And I believe we add to that, Francine put these together, the revenues in these other funds that are not part of the city, yet they are controlled funds. Correct summation?
Well,
Including RDA. Is that what you said? Or except the RDA? The RDA was what, 275? Or how much? Oh, 66 point.
so it would be in the vicinity of $400 million in revenue. I'm using the word city generically to cover all departments.
Page 11, bottom right-hand corner, 568,310,053.
Okay, that's what I thought.
That's the total revenue.
That number would represent all of the various agencies that you 5 council members preside over.
That's the 230 million,
No, that's the 568.
Well, that's why I asked the question, because the budget for 0809 at 331 did not seem to me to be representative, but
Last year, it was well in excess of 400 million. This year, it's 568.
on the summary set forth on page 12, line dealing with intergovernmental revenue, and it shows a huge increase over 0708. I'm just curious what that is attributable to.
I'm going to ask Francine to address that.
Well, let me ask her the second question, so you can do them both together. The next to the bottom line, use of property, huge increases. So I'm curious to know.
Okay, the bulk of that is related to use of property, use or sale of property. 25 million is equipment that VEMAS can move away from. The other 83 million of that is related to the Victorville 2 plant. Because we will have roughly $82 million into that plant between now and year end, and that's when the sponsor is scheduled to take that over, and we will get our money back.
Okay, going back to the 331 million number, if that represents really only a portion of the revenues because we're excluding at least RDA, and then go over to page 9, shows estimated revenues by fund at 275 million. The delta on those two is almost 57 million. Where's that 57 million going to go? Is that money that is programmed for something? Do we have cushions, reserves, anything to deal? Or said another way, what is the programmed amount for reserves? Any?
And I'm going to have to bend this around just a little bit so I can see this closely. Get some new glasses. We have, in the top of this schedule, you'll see it goes all the way across and all the different headings. Taxes, and this is on page 8. And this balance flows all the way across to a fund by fund. And you can see the general sources of revenues. We will use $17 million over on page 9, $17 million of bond loan proceeds, reductions in unappropriated fund balances across all categories, total current revenues, bond proceeds, and adjustments. That totals $240 million. The last two columns are cost allocations and transfers, and that totals the $245 million. Those are for entities that are a part of the city as it legally exists. The same information then goes to the separate funds, and those are on pages 10 and 11. The net result at the bottom of page 11 is the actual aggregate revenues across the entire city and everything that's controlled by the city, and that is $568 million.
And do you know off the top of your head what last year's total number was?
I believe that was right at $405 million at mid-year.
So this budget does reflect a substantial increase in the revenues coming to the city.
It does, and if we go from 405 to 568, the delta would be approximately 160 million. Out of the 160 million, roughly 100 million would be relating to equipment or power equipment. So that leaves about 60 million in revenues. That 60 million really accounts for use of accumulated reserves that we are using this year. We're bringing them into our cash flow statement and spending it in areas such as DIF, golf course, fire station, parks, capital expenditures this year that we didn't necessarily have last year.
John, what is our current reserves right now?
That I'll have to get for you as far as reserves across all funds. The general fund is, our estimate as of June 30 of 08 is that the general fund reserve on a standalone basis is essentially flat. As you can see from our budget for this year, it is a zero. It's a break even. But I think the general fund is fairly flat at this point and is projected to remain flat for this fiscal year.
And we don't know what the rest of them are right now?
We do have that information, but we don't normally present that. It's never been presented in any of our budgets historically. That was a question that came up. We will put in these numbers in the final budget report, which with the concurrence of the council on a final budget report is to make this, maybe take it from 300 pages to 100 pages. I don't know that it's all of the subsidiary sets, the departments, the salaries, the personnel. That is a level of detail that a lot of cities just don't do, although we have always done it here in an interest of full disclosure and to give as much information to council as possible.
Yeah, I'd like to get that number from you when you get a chance.
Okay.
The second question I have, you mentioned that use of property covered the sale of the power equipment, which has been taken out. And you may not be able to answer this question, maybe someone else can. When do we anticipate the sale of that property happening?
On VEMUS, over the course of the year, between now and, my guess, maybe March, April.
Okay, so within the year we'll sell that equipment. How much is that? Do you know? Have any idea?
We've used a number of $25 million for VEMUS, and the power plant, Victorville 2, at $82 million. And that is more than likely going to occur within the first 6 months. Sorry?
The number for the power plant?
For Victorville 2, 83 million, 82, 83 million.
Other questions or comments?
I've got a bunch, I went over this book in detail, and I've got some other questions, which I've actually asked John to give me information, which I already have. I do have, under law enforcement, you've placed two things which I'm not sure why are there, which have to do with fire. Were they put in there for a reason?
I'm sorry, which page would you read?
Law enforcement, if you go to law enforcement, I've got so many tabs here, hang on a second. There was two issues with the fire department when were under law enforcement. I'm not sure why they were there. We'll get there. There we go. It's, you have Explorer Post number 2 and Fire Museum under law enforcement. Page 55.
55.
Okay, so that's what it is.
Okay.
It's not under there, it's under, it should be under law, it should be under fire?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Not, post, yeah, that's the old fire station, that's for the,
Right, yeah, okay. But it's under fire, it's not under law enforcement.
also have the,
It's actually just the page is in the wrong
Yeah,
place,
right.
because if you look at the department code, it's 55, so it's coded to fire.
Okay.
Okay, are there any questions as to general fund or general fund departments?
Not right now. I may have some more later, but
And again, I know this is a very complex and very long document, and this is, as I said at mid-year, this is a very, very complex piece of information because of so many breakdowns, so many funds, so many sub-accounting that needs to be done. And so I would invite any members of council to submit questions, follow up, and we will respond immediately.
John, the only thing you in what you gave us today on the dais, in your item number 6, where it says, the state of California will refrain from balancing their budget by reducing our local revenues and funds. I have to say I'm not as confident as you are that they won't do that. I know we've been fighting that. That is one of my biggest concerns, that they're going to steal from us again, as they always have. And if that occurs, that's going to hurt us desperately. But I think we need to anticipate that may happen, even though we think it may not.
I have heard conversations about the state wanting to raid RDA funds
Right.
and vehicle license fee revenues, and we are getting more information on both from the League of Cities, and we will sit down and analyze where our risk position is, and of course share that with city manager as well as city council.
We have been in conversations in Sacramento, and at least the initial position from the Republican side of the legislature is that they will oppose any raid upon redevelopment agency funds, and they will also oppose any new taxes. Well, that doesn't leave a lot of options. That means cutting expenditures, so it's a good position to take, but it's going to be a tough one to hold on to.
But there are options the state legislature can do and refuses to face up to. There are programs that they've implemented. They're not mandated by the Constitution or any other voted statute that can be taken down. They refuse to do that. So, I mean, I think the philosophical issue is clear, and I'm hoping the Republicans stick to their guns and make them pull this budget back to a reasonable level. It is totally out of hand. Every dollar you raise, they've committed $1.05. That's stupid.
Are you a politician?
You don't have to respond to that, Mr. Sullivan.
It wasn't directed at you, John.
The fact that all of us up here on the dais agree with it does not require you to agree.
Yeah.
The next section that I'll refer your attention to, just in summary comments, is located on page 87, and it's Major Special Revenue Funds Overview. And you all have had a chance to read it. And again, just briefly, Measure I and Capital Impact Facilities, those are a series of funds that we manage. Measure I is a special sales tax where we get money and we are to spend it on 4 or 5 primary efforts. It's the sales tax we collect, we spend it. Capital impact facilities, again, those predominantly come from developers. The revenues come from development impact fees and user fees, and we collect those funds and we set them aside to use for specific purposes. I put this table in here which indicates that, as projected, we will have a deficit in capital impact facilities of $11.9 million by the end of the year. But I hasten to add that this same condition always exists. We are very aggressive in putting down expenditure plans. However, throughout the year, as we go through the year, generally capital projects tend to shift from year to year because we don't have the time to really get a bridge built. We may at times in the past have put $30 million on a bridge that's going to happen this year, but you can't build a bridge in a year, so it tends to slide. So I put this in as a matter of disclosure, which you will see even more of this disclosure shortly, but to put this in there that you as council know that while it may show a deficit, there are embedded in there a number of projects that we will look closer at and to see how much of that can we and will we actually spend this fiscal year. It doesn't necessarily mean that the capital impact facility funds will have a deficit. It means what we have put down to have as expenditures this year may indicate as a deficit. Historically, Measure I and capital impact facilities, those are all to be grouped. Well, back up. Capital impact facilities, those are a number of different funds. Historically, we have used those funds as a pool within and connected to each other. That grouping of funds has always had a positive balance. You'll see at the start of last year, we had $15.8 million, and we end up the year with a deficit. That is not a significant cause for concern. We will monitor it because we won't end up there. But what that effectively means is the monies that we have accumulated over the course of several years that we have not spent, this is the year we're going to spend them. We have a lot of work to do for the citizens. We have a lot of projects that we can do, and all of those projects are listed, and we have aggressively scheduled those to build those this year. There will be some pullback, however, because we won't spend all of it this year. As far as any questions on special revenues, I would invite council to ask any specific questions, and we can answer those.
Questions, comments?
Question to Measure I, and I'm still concerned about this, our being ability to start Nisqually next year. I know that, like you say, that you don't pay for everything right up front. We pay kind of as we roll along in a 2-year increment of construction, but any threat to us not being able to begin the process of constructing Nisqually latter part of next year?
Well, that's...
Let me answer. The biggest threat, I think, is Sandbag, who is attempting to require that 50% of La Mesa Nisqually be paid through development impact fees. And as John's graph shows, and when the housing market drops off, you can make the development fee anything you want. If there's nobody pulling permits and paying fees, your revenue stream drops off. This is what is fundamentally flawed with the entire approach from the state of California to try to put the cost of infrastructure on the back of development. When development is robust, those revenues are coming in. But large infrastructure transportation projects cannot be paid for in short-term upswings in the building of houses. And so Sandbag just insists on trying to go down this path that will continue to cause California's transportation infrastructure to not only fall behind development, but to deteriorate.
Well, I'm no expert on Measure I, but I've been with it since its inception, the first time. I'm not convinced that there is statutory language that allows Sandbag to make that shift or make that demand. Unless you or Andre show me some statutory authority for it. Well, at some point when we reach the end of the administrative process will be my recommendation to this council that we sue Sandbag and let a judge make a decision. We all went to this Measure I process in good faith, and we We sold the Measure I concept the first time and the second time by convincing the voters, at least of Victorville, and I think this is true for every city in the desert, that the money would be generated locally. Decision on how to spend that money would be made locally. And with all due respect to Sandbag, and I don't mean to take a shot at my friend Mr. Rothschild, I think they're a renegade agency that is out of control, trying to tell us how we spend our money, and that is offensive to me. I don't know when we exhaust our administrative remedies, but when we do, if we haven't got it fixed, that will be my recommendation to this council.
And I have to agree with both of you from just the fiscal side. It doesn't make any sense to have them hold a carrot and yank it back, because you cannot do the things that we have to do to qualify for that funding next week or next month. To do the infrastructure that we're doing to support that interchange is a 3 or 4 year process. But we've already gotten into it. You can't stop building a road in the middle of the night and say, because the funding changed, we're going to drive it right out into the middle of a cornfield and stop, or we're only going to do one lane. You can't do that. And that puts the city into a terrible, terrible position where we have invested millions of dollars in anticipation of promised funding, only to have the cost-sharing formulas change, or in this case, completely taken away. We've spent a lot of money on that process, and it's not fair to our citizens who actually paid the money in. So I agree with.
Just to add
right
one more
across the
thing to
board.
what Mayor Caldwell had indicated, we had $15 million in our hand, and now Sandbag is saying you're going to have to pick up $30 million against a zero growth base in the Victor Valley, city of Victorville or the Victor Valley. So we had $15 million sitting here, at least that would have come out of the steps. You're not going to see that money anymore for at least the next 4 years. There's no reason the state legislature doesn't have to do it. They won't do it. So that money slipped away from us, and that was half of what Sandbag was obligated for. And yet now it's gone. So basically it's a double hit on the city of Victorville. So I echo Mayor Caldwell's sentiments too, that when time is there, as we're probably going to have to take them on. And quite frankly, I'll tell you what, I think we ought to be looking at another Mojave County in the sense of transportation, forming our own COG, not the county per se, but the transportation COG itself up here. And I'll bet you that everybody in the high desert at least will have enough of Sandbag that they'll be very excited about supporting that idea in the future. But that's for another moment, another time, but it's coming soon.
Are there any questions on any of the major special revenue funds, capital impact, Measure I? Okay, we'll go on to page 106, which are the non-major special revenue funds overview. There's really only one comment in this grouping of funds, and that relates to the Fire Protection District. The only reason why it is classified as a non-major special revenue fund is because historically it has been so classified. It does not have major revenues in and of itself. The city supports that expense, and a lot of the text that you see here was repeated. It's a repeat of some of the similar comments out of the general fund when we discussed transfers into fire protection. The next major grouping of funds is located on page 213, federal grants. And this is a relatively simple area of funds. Federal grants, the CDBG, the Federal Demonstration Grant, Transportation Grant, STIP, the Federal Aviation Grant. These were the grants in this grouping of funds, each one of these that were determined to be worthy of a comment. We have a lot of smaller federal grants that are very small in nature that we don't really need to spend a lot of time discussing because they're fairly routine. I think in this category, that's true. We had federal asset seizure, and this grouping had projected revenue of $100, so not worthy of comment, except to let you know that we track this stuff separately in accordance with statute. If there are no questions on that category, the next category is on page 227. Again, there's not much in there that is not adequately reflected by the numbers, and that is debt service funds. For this year, instead of having each debt service fund or all of them congregated, we broke down debt service funds and put them in the area of funds to which they apply. RDA shows its debts and its debt service activity, and there are other groupings where our bonded indebtedness are attached to other activities, so we can see what the total cost of that activity is. And again, nothing of any significance, and by significance, the dollars might be significant, but the pattern of activity is the same that has been occurring year after year. On page 230, Sanitary District Capital Fund and SCLA bonds. Now, the SCLA bonds, that is worthy of some specific comment. As this comment indicates, on page 233, this gives basically our use of those bond funds in the uses section. It shows revenue coming into this little fund, which not only is just use of funds, but it's also the anticipated sale and how those monies to be applied. Importantly, our budget shows that of the $82 million, when it is received, that virtually all of it is repaid against bonded indebtedness. In fact, it comes out to right at $80 million, so there's less than $2 million out of any potential sales proceeds for Victorville 2 that are retained for use and reapplied to other investments or other capital costs. Now, one thing, we do have some housing set-aside bonds. Those are noted on page 232. This might be worthy of some discussion with Keith Metzler. We have for years accumulated cash reserves, fund balances, whichever term we want to use. We've accumulated significant amounts of housing funds, and we've set them aside in order to assist with low to moderate housing projects. And while we haven't historically spent all of the money that we have collected, this year, because of the success of getting the funds, we're now in a position where we can spend some of those funds, and I might add in some very significant ways. And at this point, I'm going to ask Keith to step forward just for a...
I think you caught him unprepared. He looked sheepish as he was getting up.
No, I'm afraid I put him to sleep.
What's the question?
He was asleep.
You can do this, Keith. You can do it.
I was just bragging about housing money that you've set aside for all these years, and you're dollar projects.
If I might, the housing issue that we had issued last year, I believe was February or March, was the SCLA 2007 housing series. We did issue those in the aggregate amount of about $35 million, and currently they are showing a pretty large cash balance, as Mr. Sullivan did allude to. All of those funds are programmed for expenditures. The largest of expenditure is planned against the Signature apartment complex. It's a apartment complex that the redevelopment agency approved, where we're actually serving as a major construction lender. So a lot of the funds that you see in the cash balance are actually programmed to the tune of about $24 million to fund as a construction loan. We've also been using this fund principally to acquire additional real estate assets to further our affordable housing needs in the future. The largest of the acquisitions took place just a few months ago, acquiring about 25 acres of multifamily property. We actually plan on bringing an agreement in front of you at the next council meeting to take that property one step closer towards being developed. Also, this fund has been the primary funding source
for our acquisition efforts in the Old Town area. To date, we've spent about $5 to $6 million in real estate acquisitions in Old Town, and particularly this fund has been used as a loan to the Old Town project area, similar to the discussion about the general fund loaning particular enterprises funds to get operations afloat. The redevelopment agency has actually been doing the same very similar activity amongst its project areas, loaning project funds from one project area to the other. In this case, the Old Town being it's a 10-year-old project area, but has seen no growth, and due to the lack of growth, it has very little revenues to speak of. So, of course, we've been using project funds such as this to help fund some of its operations.
Questions or comments?
Keith, as long as this money, you've got each one of them earmarked and committed to, is that, according to the attorneys, going to be enough protection for the state not to come in and raid it? You can't be in the middle of a deal and have a cash flow issue, be injured by the state saying, okay, we're going to take all of probably their low and moderate is probably their first raid, if not all of the rest of it, and put us in a box like that, could they?
I've seen two forms or two concepts being talked about. One concept would be where the state comes in and takes unencumbered funds. So, of course, that's causing everybody to race to encumber their funds today. That's one concept. The other concept, of course, is just taking, similar to how they've done in the past, just an across-the-board dollar amount based upon percentage of your actual gross tax increment revenues. Not sure which direction they're going to go, but this last several ERAFs that we've seen, they've been just cuts, or just percentages off the top. One thing particular to note, and I know Mr. Sullivan was speaking just to the SCLA bond fund, but the redevelopment agency does manage a number of different funds, and because we have a number of different projects in the queue at different times, we internally started preparing our own internal cash flow models to make sure that over a 12-month period, or even in this case of this year, over a 24-month period, that there are adequate cash reserves, not only to float operations today, but also to have cash available for the programs that are both appropriated and also projects that we foresee as projects that we want to endeavor upon.
Questions or comments? Keith, not so much from a budgetary standpoint, but there is confusion in the minds of some in regard to redevelopment agency funds and specifically the low and moderate income set aside. And while those of us up here understand it, and I suspect most of our department heads, why don't you just give us a 30-second clip as to why redevelopment agency funds can't be used to fund cops or firemen, and what are the limits with the 20% low and moderate income? Because I have people commenting, and some even in the media, well, why don't you shift some of this money and go do something else with it, go build Nisqually or something? Can't do legally. Why don't you just touch on what the legal framework is of RDA funds, and then as a subcomponent, the low and moderate income set aside?
Sure. The very basic legal framework is of all tax increment generated in a defined redevelopment project area, 20% right off the top has to be set aside to benefit low and moderate income households. Now, there's a very broad definition of what a low and moderate income household is, but basically it's a household that has a median income anywhere between 50% and 120% of the area's median income. And then there's a numbers game that gets attached to that. For all housing that's built in the redevelopment project area, there's a statutory requirement that so much housing has to benefit the low and moderate income households. So, for example, the very basic calculation is if there's 100 homes built in the project area, the redevelopment agency has a responsibility to add 15 units to benefit affordable households. A lot of cities do it differently. A lot of cities impose inclusionary housing ordinance where they basically pass that responsibility directly on to the developers. We have actually undertaken that ourselves as a redevelopment agency. And up until this last spike, I think we've done it fairly successfully. The reason why you can't just arbitrarily take that money and fund other things is because if you're not meeting your housing responsibility, the state, there is a larger threat from the state where they could basically come in and take away your redevelopment agency monies. So it's, I mean, it's really that simple. In our current state right now, and part of why you've seen very recently a number of projects come before this board that are housing projects, and you're also going to see several more, is because now we're playing catch up with respect to the surge that we've seen in the housing market over the last 4 and 5 years. We were not able to keep up in terms of our inclusionary housing responsibility. So now we're playing catch up, and is why we've issued bonds and started carrying what might appear to be cash surpluses, but they're actually cash balances with expected expenditures associated with that.
Apartment in a building complex that we've funded into this program equal to a single-family residential?
It does not matter whether it's single-family or multifamily. It's based on units. So it could be an apartment or a single-family home.
Do you have any restrictions on how long you can keep that money, or are there any restrictions on how long you can keep that money without using it on your projects?
Yes, there are. I mean, there are some laws, and we do have to demonstrate annually as a part of our annual reporting to the state the accumulation and the expenditure of those funds. One of the very basic requirements is that redevelopment agencies can't accumulate more than 5 years worth of tax increment. If they do, that's, you know, they coined that a legal definition of excess surplus, and there's legal requirements where you have to basically establish plans to spend that right away. The larger threat always for a redevelopment agency is the state of California, the Department of Housing and Community Development. And if you get on that watch list for not complying with excess surplus, then they're going to be here auditing your books and making sure you're spending those monies. Otherwise, the larger threat is they can take over your operations.
Questions or comments?
Thank you.
Although this budget doesn't have information in it on VEDA, the Victor Valley Economic Development Authority, consistent with the information that John showed earlier, the tax increment revenues passing to that entity, that is where Keith starts with how much is the 20% low to moderate housing, the balance is general economic development, consistent exactly with the graph that John showed on the front end. The tax increment going to VEDA has gone from $23 million to $34 million to $44 million in the past 3 years. So that is the reason why Keith is moving as aggressively as he is. He's had the cash funding. He's accumulated. He needs to spend it on low to moderate housing. He has always been involved in RDA, or redevelopment and development activities, but now it's a convergence of the right time. He's got the funding. Prices are down, he can make investments that help our community, and that is one reason why our capital expenditures have gone up this year. I think that was a question we had talked about earlier during the presentation. On tab 235 are enterprise funds, and the text discusses Sanitary District, Victorville Municipal Utilities, Water District 1 and 2, golf courses, solid waste, source reduction recycling, Sterling Development, our SCLA partnership, and SCLA, the Airport Authority, and finally, Logistics Rail Authority. You've all had a chance to look at this. Of all of these entities, perhaps the most most important in terms of dollars is Victorville Municipal Utilities. We talked about that earlier and how their philosophical structural change from self-generation to interconnect enables them to do so many more things. Sanitary District, nothing of any significance there, just it's operated significantly as it has in the past. Water District 1 and 2 are relatively new to the city. That represents Baldy Mesa and Victor Valley Water Company. They joined the city in August of 2007, so this next year will be their first full year. Worthy of comment is that Water Districts 1 and 2 brought with them a significant amount of fund reserves in the form of cash. They have some COPs, or Certificate of Participation. Those funds have been set aside for capital improvements and infrastructure investments. And during this budget year, there will be a significantly increased investment in our community. I mean, unfortunately, I have to sign all these documents which show how much Reggie Lamson is spending, but it's all being spent on behalf of our citizens, better water lines, new water lines. Other than that, the rail authority expenses are down, pending a change in the economic cycle, which will reactivate the inland port effort in redesigning that intermodal facility.
John, one of the things that continues to concern me and always has since I've been on the council is the loss we see at the golf course. And there's nothing you personally can do about it, but I'm hoping that at some point we can decrease that loss. And I know golf courses typically are not a moneymaker when it's a municipal utility or a municipal golf course, but I would certainly like to see that number of $1.5 million decreased substantially, and I'm hoping that the new clubhouse and what we've done at the golf courses can entice people to come in. I'm looking at Mr. Gargan back there, but we can get more play and hopefully more revenues brought in because of the clubhouse, because this is one thing that gnaws at me, and I know I get comments about it all the time, and it's always a loss. So I guess I'm making comments to the council. I hope something we can do to shrink that loss down substantially.
I don't think anybody would disagree philosophically aggressive with marketing in order to enhance play and, of course, closely monitor the expenses. But I've said this many times before, I'll just say it again, that I think we should look at it as a part of a portfolio of park and recreation activities that we provide for the community. We never judge the general park environment that has the barbecues or the pool or the racquetball courts or the tennis courts as a profit center, or at least a revenue neutral center. We historically look at these as facilities that we provide to a diverse community who have diverse park and rec interests. And while I think everything should be closely monitored for ways to generate revenue and or reduce expenses, I hope that we don't move to a point where we grade all of our park and rec activities and attach a monetary analysis to it, because I dare say Little League and summer programs and all of the things that we provide would fall into a deficit category. And say that because I think that a lot of confidence in John Gargan and his ways of monitoring these things and trying to keep fee structures in place without driving users away. It needs to be a balanced approach, in my opinion.
On pages, beginning on page 301, the redevelopment agency funds, following that is our operating expenses, revenues, operating expenses, and capital expenses. We go on through each one of the components of RDA, including low to moderate income housing, which Keith addressed a few moments ago, and broken down into the various legal entities. That's Old Town and Victorville RDA. We even further break it down as to the source of revenues. If they flow directly to our RDAs, they have their own fund. If it flows through VITA, they have their own funds. And it's just a way for us to account and to measure for the use of those funds. Nothing of any significance in here other than what Keith did discuss. The final section begins on page 324, and that is our capital improvement projects by fund. And in short, we have roughly $300 million worth of capital projects on the board. These are all not going to take place this year. What is in here is a list of all of the projects that Sean and his group and Amr and his group and John, in fact, all of the various departments across the city are working on. This schedule represents our expectation of the total cost. Some of these costs will actually be expended this year. Some of these costs are on a going forward basis. But the capital and project schedule is to keep council and our citizens advised on what we are planning over the immediate to near term in terms of capital expenditures on their behalf. Very last section is just a glossary of terms that we use. I found that to be most useful because I kept hearing some of these things and had no idea what they were talking about. Welcome to a new club. At this point, I'll ask to see if there's anyone on council that has any questions of me, and if there's any additional information that council would like to see. Our expectation is that if this proposed document is approved and forms part of our budget, that we will republish this budget. And as I mentioned, take out some of this stuff. I mean, we don't need to have a 600-page report. We'll remove some of the non-essential information, but keep in all of the essential information. We will add some more information, such as staffing levels, and Francine is our budget queen. So are we required to put into our final budget salary scales, positions, and things?
Before we let Mr. Sullivan leave the podium, are there questions or comments for Mr. Sullivan as opposed to perhaps individual departments?
Just as a general statement, I've been on this council for 20 years, and I've seen several significant iterations of how we present our budget and the organizational format. And each one of them, it takes a little bit of a learning curve, and this one I'm still at. But I've been in this book now for several hours, and this is probably the best, well-organized, and more easily understood budget than I have ever seen in all the 20 years I've been on here. John, I compliment you on the organization of the...
Well, thank you, and I'm going to pass that over to Adele and Francine and Terry, as well as our department heads, and their, the assistant department heads. There's a lot of input from a lot of different people. And this year, we sought to sort of reformat it just a little bit for that very reason, to make it a little simpler. But the heavy lifting was all done by people sitting behind me, certainly not by me. So your comments as to their effort and their dedication are very much appreciated.
Well, when you consider that, my memory's correct, our first budget for the city of Victorville was something between $500,000 and $600,000. I think when I went on the council, it was 3 or 4 million. Look at it today, 568 million. I mean, there were days when we'd get a budget that was maybe 15 pages. I mean, it wasn't much to it. So I agree with Mike. I mean, this is a document that laymen, non-finance people can read and understand, and that very much appreciated. The other comment I would make, which is not directly to you, it would pass through you to Sean. I notice in here that we have quantifications for the Nisqually Road project. I'd like to see an estimate of the cost escalation as a result of the sandbag decision, which has delayed this project again. I think it's important. I think it's a piece of information that the public needs to know. We need it with our ongoing battles with sandbag, but all of the other chores that you've got, Sean, if you could quantify that, it doesn't have to be precise, just an order of magnitude. It would be useful. And the other thing, which I would pass through you, Mr. Sullivan, to Mark Taylor, I see we're increasing law enforcement by about $2 million, and I want to put Mr. Taylor on the spot. Have we given you everything in the budget that you have asked for as our chief of police for the city of Victorville? Yes. I hear scuttlebutt that we have shortchanged the cops, and I've never known this council to do that. So I thought for the record I would hear it from the horse's mouth. Thank you.
I'd like to just mention, I had some questions for Mr. Sullivan, but going through this, he answered every one of them. And the only complaint I have, and I'm going to do it as the female of this council, I'm having a heck of a time getting the numbers off in the corner. And
binding
I almost
process.
broke her nail. I almost broke her nail. No, I'm kidding. But some of them, Francine, I just can't find the very end numbers. The binders? I like the binders better. This is very nice, though. I don't want to offend you. It's very
You
nice.
like the 3-ring binders better?
Yes.
Your explanations for each one of the categories, before you get to the meat of it, you have an explanation.
Thank you. That was contributed to largely by some folks sitting behind me. Very largely.
Mr. Roberts?
Well, I want to say something before you do. First of all, thank you for getting that information for me. I actually called Mr. Sullivan at about 1 o'clock this afternoon and requested some drill-down information specific on accounts and wanted to know everything. I have gone through this book extensively to try to find where we can cut more dollars, and I thought I'd find some. I really did. Yeah, I found $100 here, $100 there that I questioned, but when it comes down to it, when I look at what's happening with the other cities in this state, and when we even have cities that are claiming bankruptcy out there, this city, thanks not only to this council, but mostly to the department heads and the employees here, have really kept this city financially solvent. I mean, we have done a great job. We have a lot of naysayers out there that come to this dais or make comments in the paper about what we're doing, but they don't realize what we're doing is for them, and what we have done and are continuing to do is their benefit. And this budget shows it. While we're tight and we're tightening our belts, it's not because we don't have the money. It's because we want to make sure we do have the money to do what we need to do. And we are thinking out of the box to do projects that no one else is thinking to do, bringing revenue generation into this community to keep it solvent and going the way it should go. So we need to compliment ourselves and this city for where we've gone. And I got to compliment you on this budget. It was very easy to read, easy for me to get through and ask questions and comments. I have no questions for department heads. I've done it already. I've already called and asked for the information, so it's done. So I want to thank you for everything you put together on this, and I want to thank the council for what we're doing as a city. And Mr. Roberts, thank you and your staff.
Mr. Roberts, does that conclude the budget presentation at 6 o'clock, which the agenda item was scheduled for 4 to 6?
It does, Mr. Mayor.
And we started late.
You can have another 10 minutes. I was late.
We don't need it.
Good.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan.
Thank you.
Thanks to everyone, all the department heads. Great job. And my intuition tells me the budget will be adopted as presented.
I have a question, John. When do we get or do we get at the same time we adopt the budget, the benefit schedule with the salary schedule that we all adopt by resolution?
Let me check with the Human Resource Director. That's either included with the budget or we come in very shortly after the adoption of the budget.
Anything else? Workshop is adjourned.